Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Thank you and welcome. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and today on the Smithsonian Associates interview series, we are going back, way back to castles, coronations, and chaos. The background music you're hearing might stir memories of classic historical dramas or the thunder of hooves across muddy fields, but today's guest brings the drama with fact, not fiction. Historian Michael Livingston, Citadel Distinguished Professor and military history expert, is here with us to talk about his thrilling new book, Bloody Crowns, A New History of the 100 Years' War. Think you know the 100 Years' War? Think again. Livingston expands the timeline, revealing a 200-year storm of violence, strategy, and shifting power that shaped modern Europe, from Edward III's daring coup in Nottingham Castle to Joan of Arc's blazing faith on the battlefield. It's a story of longbows and betrayal of kings and peasants, and of how war reshaped nations. And the best part? Smithsonian Associate Michael Livingston, who will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. We have him today, and he makes it all deeply human, wildly entertaining, and sharply relevant. Absolutely, even today. You're listening to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. I'm Paul Vogelzang. Please join me in welcoming historian, Smithsonian Associate Michael Livingston. Dr. Michael Livingston, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
It's good to connect. Happy New Year to you and yours. What a pleasure it is to be talking to you. We're going to talk about your upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation, of course, but we're also going to talk about your wonderful new book, Bloody Crowns, A New History of the 100 Years' War. And I want to start there because the title is a bit, it struck me initially. I had to kind of read it twice. And I thought to myself, well, is this really a 2-century conflict? Because that's really what you're saying in the book. And so why was that kind of overlooked, that timeline? Because we hear the phrase all the time, the 100 Years' War. And so what is it about that time period that kind of needs to be explained better, at least to me, and help us to kind of reshape the understanding of all of that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I didn't set out to redefine the 100 Years' War. That's a pretty famous period in history. I was just doing a history of it. And it's a period I've long been fascinated by. I've written several books in the period. And I thought, well, let me just do kind of like a general history of it for folks. But the thing that happens when you start trying to compose a sort of history like that, you got to get your head around the entirety of it. And, it's like, what was it about? What started it? What ended it? And really quickly, all that began to fall apart. So the traditional dates, I would say, is actually a 116-year war, but that it doesn't look good on the chapter titles. So we just say 100 Years War, and it typically starts in 1337 and lasts to 1453. But when I came down to sort of looking at like why those dates, well, those dates were very arbitrary. The whole notion of a 100 Years War is a 19th century construction of a French guy needed a title for a chapter in a textbook. And he's like, I'll call it this. And it's all just kind of stuck, right? And so I decided to really dive into it anew and say, okay, what's actually holding events together? What is this conflict about? And in light of that, then, where are my beginning and end points? Like, start from scratch. And it turned out the starting point was 1292. And the ending point was 1492, which ended up being a nice round number, 200 Years' War. That wasn't the reason I chose those dates, but nice bonus. And it really is just a kind of like an attempt to look kind of new at this, and also without any preconceptions, right? I'm not writing pro-England or pro-France. I'm not pro-anybody, right? I'm just a historian making the call of what is the story that holds together here. The conflict, whatever it was never declared begun. There was no like declaration of war. So how do I define this? And that's what I came up with.
Yeah, I think we are familiar with the phrase "the Hundred Years' War." We're of course familiar with some of the characters in this period: Henry V at Agincourt and Joan of Arc at Orléans. But you also the research. By the way, congratulations on all the research of this book, because while those names loom large, there are plenty of lesser known figures that you have really unearthed, and so they deserve a brighter spotlight. Maybe tell us a little bit about them.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have to deal with Henry V and Joan
Yeah.
and some of these characters. You have to do that, and I give them plenty of airtime. But I also, wanted to look kind of behind the headlines. What's really driving things, and who's driving it? And there's people like Bertrand de Clisson, who's this incredible general who really turns the tide for France in the midst of all this. And there's really lesser known characters. One of my favorites is a guy named Guillaume Guillart, who's a sergeant from Orléans, who is kind of a nobody, but happens to be on one of these major campaigns, gets wounded, and because he can't serve as a soldier anymore, he decides to take his hand at writing poetry, and he ends up writing this like 30,000 line. I can't remember exactly how many. It's massive. This massive epic French history that actually tells us extraordinary amount of information because he was a sergeant. He's not a king. He's not a monk. He's not in that echelon. He's like on the ground infantry, and he's talking about what that is like. What is an encampment actually like? What is it like to be on the march? All these things that our regular sources don't tell us. And this bloke wrote this poem, and thank God he did, telling us all about it. So yeah, there's a lot of little bits of story like that I try to bring in and help us get a better sense of what war is really like in the period, and also like what kind of sources really can be brought to bear that we typically ignore. Right, most histories would never mention this guy or his work because it's not one of the big names. Yet it actually is one of the most like extraordinary sources we have.
Our Smithsonian audience of older adults and their families will really appreciate some of the generational tensions that you write about it. And in particular, you write vividly about a young Edward III reclaiming power at Nottingham Castle. I thought that was an amazing story. Maybe tell us a little bit about that and why that bold action just caught your attention, that youthful defiance, perhaps.
Well, it's important to understand Edward III as a young man, and then as a grown up, obviously, because he's a very important king. He's the guy that, in the traditional telling, starts the Hundred Years' War. By my retelling, he's kind of in the middle of it, but he really changes directions of things quite a bit with his Crécy campaign and the victory at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. So knowing kind of like how he got to that point and the things that sort of caused his development, I think are very essential. And one of those is that he grew up kind of during his really, really formative years, both as a king and a prisoner, because his mom had gotten his dad, Edward II, out of the way, Isabel of France, and meanwhile kind of shacked up with Roger Mortimer. And they were running the country for him in his name. And this moment in Nottingham Castle is him sort of saying, enough, I'm taking over myself. And yes, that means I'm going to have to arrest my mom. Like I'm going to have to do that. And her lover. And I've got to make this attack. And it is something that could end in my death, because certainly Mortimer would have killed him if he had the chance. And so, yeah, it's tremendously dramatic. And a huge roll of the dice. And I think it does speak to the kind of personality that Edward is, that he is someone who, kind of in my parlance would take the bull by the horns. Like he's that kind of guy, for better and worse. Sometimes this works out great for him. Sometimes this works out really bad for him. That tends to be the case in situations like this. So yeah, it is part of what you get in this story. I mean, it's a 200 years war is generational in several instances. One is that nobody who's there at the beginning is there at the end. Like, this is something that is passed on. People are fighting because they're fighting, right? Fighting is its own reason for continuing the fight. And it becomes habitual. And how people are responding to that and responding to their situation becomes of vital importance.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting too, because you think about 200 years of war and what that means to countries and peoples and family and how it influenced national identity even. And I wonder if you'd explain, perhaps go a little bit deeper and explain how this lengthy conflict, this lengthy medieval conflict really defined what it meant to be English, French, or Spanish throughout this period.
Yeah, or what we think of as in the Low Countries, what it means to be Flemish and things like that. Yeah, this is a book that ultimately kind of incorporates most of Western Europe. This is an international war. The wars in Scotland, people are familiar with Braveheart and stuff like that. That's part of all of this. It's not. I think we don't usually think of them as being connected, but when you actually take a raw look at it, it very much is. And yeah, one of the things that is happening is a coalescing of identity. We think of as English as having a kind of meaning. That's not the meaning that was there in 1292 when this starts. It is a meaning that is existence in 1492. Same with French. The kind of fundamental ways that these states, what we now call nations, right, are defined and define themselves. That's what this struggle is about. That is what it is really about. It's not in the end about like, well, who gets that acre of land? It's not really about that. It's about these cultural, which are vastly more significant questions of who we are. How do we define ourselves? What does that mean? And vice versa, how do we define them, right? The people kind of that we're defining ourselves against. And that's what this conflict is. And that's why it goes so long and is so bloody and awful, is because you can't easily resolve that then or now, right? This is a lingering problem of humanity, is how you define yourself and what happens as a result of those definitions. So yeah, that's absolutely one of the things that's happening here. It's one of the things I'm very keen to sort of bring to the reader is that not only the difficulty of this, but also the resonance that it then has to today's world.
We are just getting started with Smithsonian Associate Michael Livingston, and already the castles, kings, and clashing swords feel closer than ever. But remember, Bloody Crowns isn't just about battles. It's about what those battles left behind. New nations, new ideas, and a Europe transformed. Still ahead, we'll hear more from Smithsonian Associate Michael Livingston about the myths we've gotten wrong, the forgotten stories that matter most, and how this centuries-long war still echoes in our world today. Stay with us. There's more to uncover. Hi, this is Paul. Before we jump back into today's show, I want to take a moment to recognize a truly special milestone, Smithsonian Associates' 60th anniversary. Since 1965, Smithsonian Associates, the largest museum-based education program in the world, has been inspiring lifelong learners with unforgettable experiences, connecting audiences with the Smithsonian's museums, research, and experts in new and exciting ways. This year, the celebration is for you, with a full year of special programming both online and in person, from behind-the-scenes looks at Smithsonian collections to conversations with astronauts, historians, filmmakers, and curators. There's something for everyone. Smithsonian Associates has created something extraordinary. I'm proud to partner with Smithsonian Associates to share their incredible programs with the Not All Better Show audience. Thanks for being part of this journey. Here's to 60 years of curiosity, learning, and discovery. Our guest, of course, is Smithsonian Associate Dr. Michael Livingston, a historian, here to talk about his thrilling new book, Bloody Crowns, A New History of the 100 Years' War. Dr. Livingston, let's get into that a little bit. Why is it relevant? to us today? What lasting lessons can we learn from some of this prolonged conflict? Because we have examples of that going on in our world, not of 100 years war, but of lengthy conflicts throughout the globe.
Yeah, well, we've got a couple of them. They're getting close to
Yeah.
100 years, so that's fun.
Okay. Yeah, that's fun.
Great, good
Yeah,
times.
I
Um, yeah. Why is this relevant? Because it does so much to shape that.
Mhm.
So one of the key outcomes, again, it wasn't intentional. I was stopping the book at 1492 because there is a sort of peace treaty that is signed between England and France, the Peace of Étape in that year. But something else happens in 1492 that your listeners are probably far more familiar with, which is Christopher Columbus
Yeah.
and the opening of the New World. And that is there's no kind of exact correlation. There is actually some causation to why these things are tied. The reason that Columbus is having to do what he's doing is because Portugal and Spain can't push towards France as a result of all this conflict. They got to go in the other direction. But part of that is also England and France, once they are kind of stable in what they are, which is what you get in 1492. Like, okay, that's France. This is England. The lines are drawn. Now we know what everybody is. We have definitions. The fight doesn't really stop. That struggle stops. But now the fight becomes international. It becomes an imperial war, right? Colonialism. And the continuing struggles between England and France, right? That move onto this global scale. So the kind of world that we are so familiar with is directly tied to this 200 years of conflict, not just in that kind of geopolitical dimension, but also on a really domestic level. Taxation practices, standing armies, how those armies are built, how they're funded, how they are commanded, the armaments they're using because of the rise of gunpowder, like all that is the 200 years of war. All that is when this is happening. So it has an absolutely direct effect on what we see happening in the world today, right? And I think the more that we understand those kind of original seeds from which we have grown, I think the better chance we have of dealing with our world today.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, in terms of military innovations, those changes, from the longbow to standing armies, you write that even influences us today in terms of warfare and the idea of state power. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, there's no question, right? What is the state?
Mhm.
Well, at its core, it really has this kind of military life, right? That's what enables borders, to be held, and that kind of the derivation of that is all rooted in this period. Yeah, it is. It's the longbow, it's gunpowder, all of that, which is the
Mhm.
military technology, but really, underneath that is the ability to put those things in the field, right? And all that it becomes issues of logistics and finances and all that kind of stuff that most people don't really pay attention to when they think of war. They think of the front lines. They don't think about everything that's going on to make that front line possible. And this period really is got a lot to do with that, what we call the tail of the army, in addition to the teeth, right? I talk about the teeth plenty, Battle of Agincourt. I go through it all. It's awesome. It's good times. But it's really super important to understand what's leading behind that. And that as a result of those developments, we get what we think of as, again, kind of like nations today, right? If you think about what a king is, just for instance, right? The idea that the common person has of a king is not really what a king is in 1292. It is what a king is becoming in 1492. There is a vast difference in what kingship is, much less obviously what you get, coming down the pike as far as democracy and things like that. But just the idea of executive power, what it represents, what it has to bring to bear, how it controls the state. That is a development of the 200 Years' War. It's this amazing nexus of things that happens in this period that people haven't really kind of grappled with, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think we've really grappled with this notion of Scotland, perhaps in the way that you put it in the book, because we we often think of Scotland as a footnote in some of these conflicts, but in fact, you mentioned the front lines. Scotland, in your parlance, is the enemy in the rear. And so maybe talk about that, what that means, and how some of these border powers, in addition to Scotland, really shaped some of the struggle.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to think of this as France versus England, in large part thanks to like this guy named Shakespeare who wrote some plays that did okay.
Yeah.
Uh, they did good. They did good. He knows what he's doing. But he really kind of built a sort of idea of this conflict and what it was about, of England versus France. When again, it's England creating England. It's France creating France. It's Scotland creating Scotland. And all of these things in relation to one another, none of them exist independently. So to talk about what's happening between two of the powers, you kind of have to talk about the rest of them too.
Mm-hmm.
Scotland obviously has really strong connections to France in what's called the Old Alliance. So Scotland has reason to fight England when England is fighting France, not only for themselves, but also for their allies in France. And attacking from the rear is quite useful in that regard. And if the English come after Scotland, well, the French attacking in the English rear is good for them in that regard as well. But it's, of course, not just them. It's also the Welsh. It's the peoples of the Low Countries, what we would think of as Belgium and the Netherlands today, but were then kind of this amazing quilt patchwork of smaller states. It's the Holy Roman Empire. It's the Papal States in Italy, and it's what's going on over in Spain. There are major battles of the 200 Years' War that are in Spain. And the reason they're in Spain is, again, because this isn't really just this single axis of England versus France. It's how do we, fight each other even in proxy battles, right? How do we do this? And it becomes metastasizing like a cancer across Europe. So yeah, when you think about this struggle, though England and France are kind of the dominant players, first of all, we have like, what the heck is England and what the heck is France? But then what are these other powers that they are utilizing against each other? And those powers are, of course, utilizing France and England in turn, right? The Scots aren't fighting just to help France. They're fighting to help the Scots, right? So, this is just a far more complicated, kind of relationship and geopolitically than I think people tend to get it credit for. It really has a lot more in common with today than we would think of, where every action is not in a vacuum. It all has reverberative effects across the world. It's really kind of the case here too.
It's further complicated, at least in my mind it was, as I was doing my research of you and the book and your upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation. It's complicated by this notion that, in fact, battles aren't necessarily decisive, you're right. And when we think of struggles, we think of, crushing an opponent perhaps, but I wonder, tell us what you mean by that a battle doesn't necessarily have to be decisive, that there's a myth around that. What impact does that have on how we teach history and remember it today?
Look, battles are amazing. It seems weird to say I love battles because I'm not in favor of these things happening. But as a military historian, they're amazing things to study, and that's great. And they are very dramatic, right? It's kind of like kill or be killed. It's just a lot of exciting stuff happening. But, well, what do battles often decide? They actually don't usually decide much in and of themselves. It's not like there's a victor and the defeated is like, well, I guess that's the end of the fight. Not usually. They are dramatic moments, but they aren't culminating typically. The number of decisive battles, that truly decide the moment is actually very, very small, even though we put battles forward as this moment where everything is decided. So even in fact, 1346, the Battle of Crécy, which I've called the Battle of Five Armies, right? You've got the King of England on one side and four kings on that field against him. He's outnumbered, he's outgunned, he's in France, and he wins. He wins big. But it's not like the next day the French king was like, well, you're now the king of France. Like not even remotely, right? That's 1346. This battle doesn't get over until 1492, and the French win the whole war. So it really doesn't decide anything in that kind of, again, sort of geopolitical terms. Battles decide things in other ways. So there, for instance, the Battle of Crécy, well, it enabled Edward to then go on and take Calais, which is a fairly famous event. Uh, and it also put England on the map, kind of internationally, because it was a very international fight with all these kings there. And wow, the English won. Who are the English? Who are those folks? And all of a sudden, England is on the map. So it can have those sort of effects, sure. But I think too often, popularly, people tend to think of battles as this kind of, end all be all. This is a culminating moment, and that just really doesn't work. And I think, sort of in today's world, that is actually very dangerous if you're thinking of military activity as that kind of endeavor, right? That we're fighting for this one moment. We'll just do that, and everything changes. No, it's going to be way more complicated than that. And thinking in those ways is not a good way to go about it.
Again, congratulations on the book. Of course, Dr. Michael Livingston is our guest today, Smithsonian Associate, written Bloody Crowns, A New History of the 100 Years' War. We'll have links so that our audience can find out more about Dr. Livingston and his upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation. The book is excellent. You uncover, in addition to all of this work around the battles and the myths that surround that, you talk about kings and generals, but you also go into detail about the conflicts between peasants and the peasant revolts that occurred, and perhaps mercenary bands that are fighting against each other, even economic collapse. And I thought that was all an interesting way to think about battles and think about, kind of prolonged warfare. And so what was it that you learned about some of the shifts that took place economically and within certain groups of people, these mercenary bands that a prolonged conflict really brings about?
Yeah, and I'm glad you picked up on that, because it is such a thing that's vital to me. Is when you think of warfare, it's so easy to think about, and you see this in documentaries or whatever, like colored blocks moving on a landscape, and everything's kind of clean, as it were, right? Warfare is not that way. Battles are not that way. And that's a way that we have to think about them. But in the end, right, this is human beings on a field. And those human beings all have varied interests, right? The king might have a reason for fighting this fight, but not everybody on that field shares that vision. And when we extrapolate that out to the war itself, right, beyond just the battlefield, right, and what is it that everybody is fighting for? Who is really doing the fighting, right? And how much choice do they have in the matter? And especially taking this kind of long view of this conflict from 1292 to 1492, you inevitably see these reactions to power, right? As power is coalescing, say in France in the form of the king. Well, there are people who don't want the king to have that power, right? And they're going to fight against that. So this is not only a story of these big kind of armies in the field fighting for kings. It's also a story of repetitive civil wars within those countries, as those in power overplay their hand or aren't doing well enough, whatever it is, to cause these economic and social collapses within the conflict. So it is it's very human to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's very human. It's a very kind of, this is how things are. But it's not the way we usually see this. We usually kind of look at these things in silos, and I'm really interested as a historian and as a writer in breaking down silos and trying to give people the fullest picture as easily as I can.
Yes, you're most definitely a historian. I refer to that, and your bio spells that out. But you're also a gifted storyteller, and the episodes of the people involved and the shifts that we've kind of talked about within kind of the various groups, and just going so far as to talk about the kings and the generals. That storytelling is very, very human. Was there a moment in your research that the story really struck you as one that was personally just beyond kind of history, but just really touched you?
Well, yeah, repeatedly. I mean,
Yeah.
200 years of this stuff.
Yeah.
It happens again and again and again. And obviously, yeah, as a storyteller, right? I'm wanting to get the history in a way that's going to be fascinating to people.
Yeah.
Joan of Arc, of course, is a magnificent story. It was a very difficult chapter to write as a result because she's so utterly fascinating. But actually, the one that really kind of comes to mind as something that just fascinated me was the starting point. Like, why 1292? Well, in 1292, two ships come ashore on a small island in the Atlantic that nobody will have heard of, and it's fine. They come to a shore on a small island. One is kind of on the British side of things, English side of things. The other's on the kind of French side of things, but they're not at war. And these two ships both go on the island to try and get water at the same time. And there's an disagreement about who's going to get water first. A fight breaks out and a man is killed. And that basically starts the 200 Years' War. We actually don't even know what side this guy was on, which ship he was from. What we know is that death caused a tit-for-tat escalation that soon had fleets and towns being burned. I mean, it's a single death of a sadly unnamed individual, and yet it caused the dominoes to fall for this major calamitous thing for 200 years in Europe. Much as the death of Archduke Ferdinand, really causes World War I. And you're like, well, how did that happen? Like, how is it that just that one guy? Well, here's the dominoes. The same thing happens here, and I when I sort of like kind of came across that and put all that together, it really did kind of move me on two levels. One is, how familiar is that? And the other, how kind of horrible is it that we don't know this guy's name? And it sort of signifies that loss that we have when we go to the past, and how careful we have to be about how we fill in that loss with our own prejudices and our own concerns. So that moment, that guy, really stick with me.
So well done. Of course, Smithsonian Associate Dr. Michael Livingston's been our guest, author of Bloody Crowns, A New History of the 100 Years' War. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your service. Excellent job with the research and all of the work. Congratulations. We will have lots of links to Dr. Livingston's work, including his upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates, which is going to be wonderful. Dr. Livingston, again, Happy New Year to you and yours. Thanks so much for your time today. We sure appreciate it. And selfishly, as you do more work around any of these subjects, history is a real thrill, and you bring it to life so well. So we'd love to have you back.
Thank you. I'd love to be back. I appreciate it. This is wonderful.
Thank you. What a conversation. Thank you to Smithsonian Associate Michael Livingston, who will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Please check out our show notes for more details about his upcoming appearance. We've had him today. He's taken us beyond the classroom and deep into the heart of one of the most turbulent, fascinating periods in history. Bloody Crowns is more than a military history. It's a reminder that what we think we know is just the beginning, and that the people of the past weren't so different from us, complicated, determined, and caught in forces larger than themselves. To hear more episodes like this one and to explore our full catalog of previous shows, visit us online at notold-better.com. You can follow us on Twitter at notoldbetter and Instagram at notoldbetter for updates, behind-the-scenes extras, and upcoming guests. This has been a production of NOBS Studios. I'm your host, Paul Vogelsang, part of the Smithsonian Associates interview series here. Thanks for spending time with us today. Happy New Year to everyone. Be well, be safe. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better show on radio and podcast. Thank you. I hope you'll join me again next time. We've got a big new year coming.